Hey everyone, this is our Bible study for Sunday, November 22nd, 2020. We're continuing our study in the Foundations material from the Gospel Advocate. This quarter we have been looking at the book of Genesis. This is part 1. Next quarter we'll still be in the book of Genesis and we'll notice part 2. This morning we're ready for lesson 12. So we've just got this lesson and one more for this quarter, and then we'll move into next quarter's material. This morning, lesson 12 is on Abraham promised a son. It's taken from Genesis chapter 18, verses 1 through 15. To start out, I want us to spend a little bit of time looking at some quotes in the bigger book, which I know many of you do not have. Then we'll also notice some quotes in the smaller book that most of you have available to you if you're members of the congregation here. And so in the big book, the author says, in time, God changed the name of Abram to Abraham. It was a small change. Abram means exalted father, or my father is exalted. Given the scarcity of references to God as father in the Old Testament, the former translation is likely better. Abraham, though, means a father of a multitude. God told the patriarch he would be fruitful. Kings and nations would be among his descendants. More important than the name change, God made a pact or a covenant with Abraham. The two are part of the same transition. God declared circumcision would be a sign of the covenant between Abraham, his descendants, and the God they served. Every male child was to be circumcised on the 8th day. Just as a side note, if you've been attending on Sunday mornings as we've gone through the series Is the Bible Inspired, when we looked at circumcision and the foreknowledge of the Bible, we noticed the significance of this 8th day, and that it's on that day that newborns have this clotting hormone that's at the highest level that it will ever be throughout life. And so it's interesting that Moses, when he gives the command about circumcision, that it is to be done on the 8th day, but obviously Moses didn't know about that about newborns, but God did. And so this circumcision was going to be a sign of the covenant between God and man. While God would have considered circumcision to be an appropriate sign of the covenant between God and his people has eluded scholars. Perhaps it was a symbol of male's fortitude, of his masculine pride, his willingness to submit himself to God. At the same time, Yahweh changed the name of Abraham. He changed the name of Abraham's wife. She had been Sarai, but from the moment God made a covenant with Abraham and his family, her name became Sarah. Both names mean something like princess. God repeated the promise he had made with Abraham to Sarah. For her part, she was to be the mother of nations and kings. Later, Sarah laughed when she heard the promise of God. But first it was Abraham who laughed. They were an odd couple. It seemed impossible that Sarah would have the strength in her old age to bear a child. Whatever human wisdom might suggest, Yahweh said in only a year Sarah would have a child. Hearing God's command and hearing of the covenant between God and himself, every male of Abraham's household, including Ishmael and Abraham, was circumcised. Abraham was 99 years old when he was circumcised. Ishmael, his son, was 13. The names Abraham and Sarah are not the only new ones in Genesis 17. For the first time, Yahweh, the one true living God, wears the name El Shaddai. The precise meaning of the term is uncertain. Some think it has the sense of God being all-knowing. Others think it means God of the mountain heights. The translation of Almighty God comes from the Greek translation of the Old Testament, made in about 200 BC. The promise that Abraham and Sarah would be parents of a child seemed impossible. The odd couple had some doubts in themselves, but the visit of the three men who came to Mamre near Hebron, where the couple lived, directed them to place their confidence in the promise. It was perhaps the most significant event in the lives of Abraham and Sarah. The visit of the three men was a prelude to God's punishment of Sodom and the surrounding cities, which we'll notice in next week's lesson. It explained the origins of Israel's neighbors, Moab and Ammon, and it set the stage for the command God gave the patriarch to sacrifice his son. And so as we come to Genesis 18, we're seeing a transition taking place. We're seeing the fact that this promise is going to be happening very soon. Remember, originally God made the promise when Abraham was 75. He's now 99. And so many years have passed, but God has not forgotten. God has not set aside his promise. God is still going to keep his promise. As we've noticed several times, though, he will do that in his own time. The author of the little book says Abram was 75 years old when God promised to make him a great nation. We notice that in Genesis chapter 12. After 10 years passed, he was still childless. Sarai took matters into her own hands and gave her maid Hagar to Abraham as wife. We noticed that last week in chapter 16. We noticed all the problems that caused. When we try to do God's job, we'll mess it up every time. Although Ishmael was born to Abram and Hagar, he was not the son of promise. Another son would have that honor, Isaac. This is made clear by the Lord's declaration in Isaac, your seed shall be called. Before Isaac's birth, when Abram was 99, God renewed the covenant. He declared, I am Almighty God, walk before me and be blameless. And I will make my covenant between me and you, and will multiply you exceedingly. Then Abram fell on his face, and God talked with him, saying, As for me, behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be a father of many nations. Besides identifying circumcision as the sign of the covenant, God, as we noticed in the other quote, changed the names of Abram and Sarai to Abraham and Sarah. He then said to Sarah, And I will bless her, and also give you a son by her. Then I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations, kings of people shall be from her. After Abraham questioned God and proposed Ishmael as the one to fulfill the promise, God responded, No, Sarah, your wife shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant, and with his descendants after him. There was no doubt about it. Abraham and Sarah were going to have a son of their own. And so chapter 17, all that's taking place. We kind of skip over that as we come to chapter 18, but there's a lot that takes place from when Ishmael is born to the point that we're at now in chapter 18. And in fact, we see that roughly 13 years has passed. Our lesson text, Genesis 18, 1 through 15, contains a reiteration of this promise. In fact, as Steinman noted, this visit is the last time that Genesis speaks of Yahweh appearing to Abraham, making it the climax of God's continuing promises and pronouncements to the patriarch. Despite Abraham and Sarah's advanced age, God assured Abraham, Sarah, your wife, shall have a son. Upon hearing this declaration, Sarah laughed within herself. Nevertheless, the author of Hebrews reported, By faith Sarah herself also received strength to conceive seed, and she bore a child when she was past the age, because she judged him faithful who had promised. Whether she initially believed it was impossible to have a child at her age, or simply thought the statement was too good to be true, Sarah eventually trusted God. That brings us to verse 1 of our lesson text. Once again, we're in Genesis chapter 18. Then the Lord appeared to him, him being Abraham, by the terebinth trees of Mamre, as he was sitting in the tent door in the heat of the day. And we're going to notice the word Lord is used. We have a couple of different words in the original language that is being used. Here we have the word Yahweh, sometimes translated Jehovah. Sometimes, depending on what translation you're reading, it might appear in all caps or just with a capital L. But the word Yahweh here, we're told right here off the bat that this is God who is going to be appearing to him. If not God, the first person of the Godhead, many think more than likely the second person of the Godhead. Of course, eventually we come to know him as Jesus, as the Messiah. But at this point, he's not yet appeared or not yet come in human form. Verse 2, So he, Abraham, lifted his eyes and looked, And behold, 3 men were standing by him, and when he saw them, he ran from the tent door to meet them and bowed himself to the ground. The author of our book said Abraham's reaction to the visitors indicates his perception of their importance. Kissling remarked, by running during the heat of the day, Abraham shows the importance with which he regards his guests. He shows his respect by bowing to the ground. And as we'll notice, it's not clear yet if Abraham realizes how truly important his guests are, whether he realizes that this is indeed God and his messengers that is appearing to him. We don't know, because in verse 3, as we're about to see, as Abraham runs to them, he bows himself to the ground, which was a customary greeting this time. And he says, and said, my Lord, if I have now found favor in your sight, do not pass by your servant. The word Lord here is a different word. It's the word Adonai. Sometimes you'll hear Adonai. There's different ways that it's pronounced. Regardless, it's a word that doesn't necessarily have to mean that it's a reference to God. It's the word that's used generically as showing deference to someone as a superior. You'll see Sarai called Abraham Lord, showing him that he was the one that was in charge. And so it's a customary greeting during this time. So it's not clear if Abraham actually knows who he's speaking to. Depending on what translation you're reading from, the New King James chooses to capitalize Lord there. Of course, we know that that is the case because of verse 1 and then again in verses 13 and 14, but it's not clear if Abraham knows that yet. And so on page 130 in the little book, the author kind of mentions, though, Abraham's reaction to these guests. He says, such an appearance is known as theophany. If that's a new word to you, welcome to the club. It was a new word for me. I never heard the word theophany before. The word theophany is when someone experiences an appearance from God, and God appearing as a man. And so that's what we have here. He said, whether Abraham was initially aware of God's presence, his hospitality is appropriate for such an occasion. Curavella explained, the patriarch's response to this theophany is entirely submissive and deferential. He sees, runs, bows, verse 2, requests, verses 3 through 5, hurries, verse 6 times 2, runs again in verse 7, hurries again in verse 8, makes, takes, and gives, we see that in verses 7 and 8, stands solicitously watching his guests eat, verse 8, the perfect host. Abraham is evidently treating God the way he should. And so whether or not Abraham realized that's what he was doing, that's what we see him doing here. In verse 4, he says, please let a little water be brought and wash your feet and rest yourselves under the tree. Now, as we're looking at all of this, we may be wondering, why is Abraham doing this? It seems like a big to-do for just 3 strangers that happen to be walking by. The author of our little books lets us in on a custom of the day that makes all of this, it makes more sense when you understand it based on their customs. He says this offer reflected the common courtesy of the time. Making this point, Gresham wrote, Abraham's action was an illustration of ancient Near East hospitality, especially for people who lived on the fringes of society and had little opportunity to visit with or entertain guests. And so this was a common practice during this time. He says, moreover, in that culture, the host was obligated to provide for his guests' needs and safety while they remained with him. And so we see that Abraham is doing what was customary during this time, to be a gracious host and to take care of the needs and the safety of those who came to him. That brings us to verse 5. As he asked them to sit down, he brings some water for them. You may recall that this was also customary when we come to the New Testament. They didn't have closed-toe shoes as much like we have today. Most shoes were a form of a sandal, and so people's feet would become dirty, dusty during long trips, and so water was normally brought so that they could wash those feet. In verse 5, he says, and I will bring a morsel of bread that you may refresh your hearts. and that you may pass by, inasmuch as you have come to your servant. They said, do as you have said. And so Abraham says, let me have you sit down here under the tree so you can rest a little bit. Let me bring some water so you can wash your feet. Let me provide a morsel of bread. As we're going to see, he's going to do way more than that. But he's seeking to take care of his guest. Verse 6, so Abraham hurried into the tent to Sarah and said, quickly, make ready 3 measures of fine meal, knead it, and make cakes. And so he's not just going to give them some stale bread. He's having Sarah make fresh bread for them. And so this bread is being prepared for them. Verse 7, while that's going on, Abraham ran to the herd, took a tender and good calf, gave it to a young man, and he hastened to prepare it. Verse 8, so he took butter and milk and the calf which he had prepared, and set it before them, and he stood by them under the tree as they ate. On page 131 in the middle book, about middle ways down in the page, according to Gangle and Brammer, Abraham spared no expense in the hospitality that he extended. Sarah used fine flour, and Abraham selected a choice, tender calf. Notice also the interesting phrase at the end of verse 8. This was something that was interesting to me because I didn't realize this until this study. While they ate, he stood near them under a tree. This was the posture of a servant, standing just far enough away from guests to avoid the appearance of intrusion, yet close enough to be summoned to meet their needs. You know, if you watch movies, I'm thinking about Downton Abbey right now that Micah watched, and I would watch some of that with her. One of the things that I always remembered, this kind of setup, the servants would serve, and then they would step back. They would not be in the way, they would be back, and of course, if something was needed, they were right there to be called upon to help with that. But I never thought about that in relation to what Abraham's doing here. It's the same thing. Abraham has served them, and now he steps back away, close enough to where if something is needed, he can meet that need, but also back enough so they don't feel like he's trying to be intrusive. In verse 9, the author, Moses says, then they said to him, where is Sarah your wife? So he said, here in the tent. And he said, I will certainly return to you. This is the one of the guests, the principal one. There's one individual that seems to be the one in charge. Of course, we're going to see that the word Yahweh is used to refer to that individual, as it was in verse 1. It'll be the same in verses 13 and 14. And so that individual, Yahweh, speaks up and asks where Sarah is. And he begins to explain to Abraham something about his wife. He said, I will certainly return to you according to the time of life. And behold, Sarah your wife shall have a son. Sarah was listening in the tent door, which was behind him. And so evidently Sarah is nearby, but she's kind of obscured from sight. She's behind the door of the tent, listening. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, well advanced in age, and Sarah had passed the age of childbearing. You know, this is interesting that, it might have been when this promise was first made that Sarah was towards the end of her ability to bear children, but still might have been physically possible if she had not been barren. But God has now waited to the point we see that she's past the age of childbearing. It's not even humanly, from our standpoint, it's not possible anymore. Verse 12, therefore Sarah laughed within herself, saying, after I have grown old, shall I have pleasure, my Lord being old also? And it seems that maybe Sarah's statement here references the idea that Abraham was past the age of being able to have children as well. And so God is waited until a point where if this takes place, there's no other explanation other than God is the one who's making it happen. On page 132 in the little book, the author says, her initial response to the promise was based on her age. According to verse 11, both Sia and Abraham were old, well advanced in age, and Sarah had passed the age of childbearing. Whether or not Sarah had actually heard the Lord speak to Abraham and make similar promises previously, the idea seemed outrageous. And so we're not told whether or not if Abraham has told Sarah about the previous promises that God has made to him. whether she has any clue. I mean, obviously she had some idea because of the incidents where she offers Hagar, but maybe she had not heard all of the promises. Regardless, when she hears it this time, we see her response that she laughed within herself. This wasn't an audible laugh that could be heard, but the idea, she thought, this is crazy. There's no way that this can take place. In verse 13, and the Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh, saying, shall I surely bear a child since I am old? If Abraham did not know who he was speaking to up until this point, I think now he does know. The fact that this individual has declared to him something that has happened that he's unaware of, and that this individual could not have known without being all-knowing. Verse 14, is anything too hard for the Lord? And once again, we've shifted back from that generic word for Lord to the word Yahweh or Jehovah. At the appointed time I will return to you, according to the time of life, and Sarah shall have a son. In the book, the author says, Wood suggested this revelation caused Abraham to realize his visitor was a divine being. Regardless, Selhammer said, saw it as a key to the entire episode. He wrote, the subtle changes in the wording of Sarah's thoughts revealed that the Lord was not simply restating her thoughts, but was interpreting them as well. God then asked, is there anything too hard for the Lord? This question indicates God's plan to do what seemed impossible. Once the obstacle to the physical impossibility of Sarah's giving birth to a son was firmly established, the Lord repeated his promise to Abraham. In the course of this brief but important narrative, the reader has come to a new level of understanding regarding the promise of a son and its potential fulfillment. The promise was beyond all physical possibility. It was not, however, beyond the capability of God. This section of our text wraps up in verse 15, but Sarah denied it. Obviously, Sarah's saying, that didn't happen. And she said, I did not laugh, for she was afraid. And, that makes sense. Obviously, she's realizing, too, that their guests are divine, whether or not that it's, the second person of the Godhead or angels or what have you. They realize that there's more to these visitors than meets the eye. And as a result, she's afraid because of her reaction. And so she says, I did not laugh. And he said, no, but you did laugh. And so the angel or God, whoever is being represented here, she tries to deny it and not going for it. The book says, although Sarah attempted to deny her initial response to the promise, God was aware. We would do well to remember that all things are naked and open to the eyes of him to whom we must give account, Hebrews 4:13. Thankfully, she responded appropriately and judged him faithful who had promised, Hebrews 11:11. That brings us to our two applications that we want to notice before we close out. The first application that the author gives us, the kindness Abraham extended to his guests is characteristic of those who follow God. Certainly, the customs of the ancient world played a role in his response to the visitors. Nevertheless, hospitality is still needed in our day. Making this point, Paul declared Christians should be given to hospitality, Romans 12:13. Peter also wrote, be hospitable to one another without grumbling, 1 Peter 4:9. It is possible Abraham's actions in Genesis 18 provide the basis for the statement found in Hebrews 13:2. Do not forget to entertain strangers, for by so doing, some have unwittingly entertained angels. And so the Bible teaches us, just as Abraham was given to hospitality, we should be as well. Christians should be hospitable. We should be those who seek to help others, to be gracious hosts towards others, to be servants of others. We see that in Abraham, and as Christians, we should see that in ourselves as well. The second application, the author says, Sarah initially laughed when she heard the promise. Abraham did the same on an earlier occasion in chapter 17 and verse 17 of the book of Genesis. It's interesting, we put all this emphasis on Sarah and her laughing, but she wasn't the only one. Abraham did as well. Despite these reactions, the two came to trust in God. Hebrews 11:12 described the result of that trust. Therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead, was born as many as the stars of the sky in multitude, innumerable as the sand which is by the seashore. God's promises are always true, even if they seem hard to believe. We must trust and obey. You know, something else that in this application point that stood out to me was the fact that Abraham and Sarah, they weren't perfect, but they were growing. They were learning. Their initial reaction was not their eventual reaction. And the same is true as we think about ourselves. You know, none of us are probably where we want to be. But hopefully we're doing everything that we can to move steadily in that direction. I've heard the statement made before, and it's always stuck with me. The Christian life is not about perfection, but it's about direction. Are we pointing ourselves in the right direction? Remember one preacher illustrated it, that ideally this is when we're born, this is when we die, and this line here represents living faithfully. And ideally, the line would look like that. It would just be a straight line from well, maybe not birth, the point when we become a Christian might be the better. But anyways, it would be a straight line. But realistically, it looks more like this. But hopefully, as we get closer and we live longer, that straying away from that line of faithfulness becomes less and less. In other words, we grow. And that's what we see in Abraham and Sarah. And that's what we want to see in our lives as well. Well, that wraps up our study this morning in Lesson 12 in Genesis 18. As I said, next week we'll be looking at the account of Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis chapter 19. And so I hope that you will tune in again when we study that together. I want to thank you for taking time out of your day to spend a little bit of time in God's Word. Remember, friends, stay healthy, stay hopeful, stay prayerful, and I hope that you have a great day.